Our next presentation is just a little different from the format we've enjoyed over the last couple of days, whereupon our presenter is not here with us. The presentation will be off DVD. John Buchanan is the Director of the Workplace Research Centre at the University of Sydney Business School. He's done some really interesting research in recent times on the way the labour force is changing and likely to further change from what we know as the normal wage earners into newer forms of employment and labour contracts. His presentation today, though, is titled Maximising Societal Benefits of Apprenticeship Training.
Thanks very much for having me at your event today. I'm sorry I couldn't make it. My father was an electrical fitter and went on to become an armaments officer in the Air Force, and he trained me up to be a trades assistant, so I have a deep affection for the electrical trades. I was also quite attracted to participating in this event because I was asked to discuss the future of the trades, and so I've called my talk today The Trades, Apprenticeships and the Future of Work. What is Australia to do about intermediate skills? I want to deal with 6 issues. I want to talk about the challenges that we currently face, and I think there are 4 which I'll outline. We then have got to make sense of how we overcome those challenges, and I'll first of all talk about what does Australia do well in managing labour market problems. But then I'll say the second problem with the current situation is that it's not very good at looking after the middle 2/3 of the population. We're very good at looking after the top and we're very good at looking after the bottom, but the big chunk in the middle, we're not very good. And that leads to my key story today, which is intermediate skills are incredibly important, and the apprenticeship model of learning is absolutely vital to revitalising this part of our society. And then I want to finish up by offering some pretty clear conclusions on what I think needs to be done, and your Industry Skills Council's got a critical role to play in renewing occupations and revitalising the apprenticeship model of learning. So let's go to the first substantive overhead on overview. What are the 4 really big problems in the labour market today? Well, I think there are 4. The first is skill shortages. We've heard about these often. They're particularly stark in the trades area, but they're also strong amongst early career professionals, particularly in the technical areas of engineering, accountancy and medicine. So that's the first big problem, skill shortages. The second is quality in the vet system. This is a really big issue and is not really being properly sorted out. The third is job quality. Australia has the highest level of casual employment anywhere in the Western world. And the fourth one is the problem of social inclusion and workforce participation, with our society having around 1.5 million people on the welfare system, many of whom want to work but aren't given opportunities in the labour market. So they're pretty big issues: skill shortages, vet quality, job quality, and the exclusion of many people from paid employment. How are we to make sense of these problems and what can we do about them? Well, the first thing is to note what Australia does well. Australia's really good at beating itself up and saying we're hopeless jokes, but there are some things that we do extremely well. And the first slide here on what we do well is looking at the low-paid workforce. And the low-paid workforce is defined by the OECD as those people who get less than 2/3 of median earnings. Now, median earnings is the person in the middle of the income distribution who's, slap bang in the middle. Somebody is called low paid if they get only 2/3 of that. If you look at this data, you'll see that in the US today, 1 worker in 4 is low paid. In the UK, it's 1 in 5. In Australia, it's only 14%. That's 1 in 6. That is a significant achievement because we've seen inequality increase, but the Australian award system has worked very effectively to protect many of those low-paid people. So we do that extremely well. The second thing we do extremely well is by and large train professionals to a very high standard, and our higher education system is one of the best in the world. In fact, higher ed is now one of Australia's top 10 export sectors. In one way of looking at it, it's one of the top 3 export sectors. That's a sign that people overseas value what we do. And our professionals, particularly in medicine, engineering, law and accounting, are highly valued overseas. But we've got to recognise that professionals only constitute around 15 to 20% of the workforce. So that leads to my second key argument, what does Australia not do so well? And that is the bit in the middle. So we look after those at the bottom 15%. We look after those at the top, about the top 20%, but there's a big chunk in the middle. And what's been going on there is not a happy story. We've seen a hollowing out of jobs at that level. We've seen an erosion of labour standards, and we've seen a reform to try and fix this up go wrong, and that was the Carmichael model of labour market reform, where he was trying to break down trades-based work and move to an integrated career path based around competencies. That just hasn't worked. So let me elaborate on each of those in turn. This table here looks at managers, professionals and the like, the key occupational groups in Australian society. And you'll see since the mid-1980s there's been a growth in professionals, but equally there's been a growth in lower skilled work. Where things have gone backwards and backwards badly is in the trades. As a proportion of the workforce, trades workers have dropped from 16.2% to 12.5% over the course of the 80s and 90s. So that represents a growth in jobs at the top and a growth in jobs at the bottom. The second big thing that's changed, and this is the most complicated table, I'm sorry about that, this is on page 8, but what it says in a nutshell is that the award system has slipped from providing solid labour market standards for most people in the workforce to only providing standards of support for those at the bottom. So if you look at this figure, the C10 rate, that's the entry-level trades rate in the Metal Industry Award, is currently guarantees a worker $18.58 an hour, or $37,714 a year. The OECD, as I mentioned earlier, defines low pay as 2/3 of median earnings. Currently that's $21.30 an hour. So that means the current C10 rate in the award is below the OECD low wage standard. That means that for people who can't reach an enterprise bargain and who don't have the capacity to negotiate an over-award, they have seen their living standards significantly compromised, and I've provided data in there on what that looks like. The third thing that has really affected what's gone on in that middle strata of the Australian labour market has been the failure of the Carmichael model of reform. In the 1980s, the Manufacturing Workers Union, along with the Metal Trades Industry Association, had a vision, a very noble vision, one I actively supported at the time, of trying to open up career paths. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see there was this vision that people could move from being a trades assistant to become a trades level worker. Through the use of competency-based training, they could then move to an engineering technician and become ultimately a degree qualified engineer. This kind of seamless career path, which would be supported both in the workplace and in the education and training system. We have been studying, I actually did my PhD on this area. I did my PhD on the impact of the metals restructuring model on the engineering labour market. I've been looking at this for a very long time. And a group of us in the centre here have gone back and got statistics from the Household Income, Labour and Dynamics Survey of Australia, the so-called HILDA study. This has data on over 10,000 individuals and it's tracked them for 10 years. So it goes back to the same person, or the same family actually, year after year, and says what's been going on with your job, your wages, your hours, your training. And it allows us to see how many people actually started off as a trades assistant, worked their way to be a tradesperson, and then on to being a degree qualified engineer. And if we look at the next overhead, this is page 11. This is scatter diagrams which track individual life histories. And you'll see on that, that first one in the middle there, that's basically trades workers. And that big chunk, I think it's blue, I've got black and white here, but if that big chunk of blue, that's basically trades workers, and that's telling you if you started off a trades worker, you basically stay a trades worker. The other diagram on the right, this is the multicoloured one, which I think's got a lot of yellow in it. That yellow basically represents low and semi-skilled work. These people churn between unskilled manual work, unskilled service work, welfare, and back into unskilled work. Basically what we've had is tradespeople stay as tradespeople and process workers churn through low skill work. We've been doing our own study where we've been tracking 8,600 workers for 5 years. This means we can actually go back to the data and we can actually say who conform to the Carmichael model. And we've actually found a couple of people who started off as trades assistants, worked their way through trades, up into technicians, and now are degree qualified engineers. We found 2 of them and we phoned them up and we say, how did you do it? And they said, we wouldn't recommend anyone ever does this. It nearly destroyed their family lives. The capacity to study requires stripping out all your discretionary time. So yes, it is possible to move from a process worker to a degree qualified engineer, but our current support structures are not there. People don't get paid training leave. Employers, whilst they're sympathetic with the outcome, do not put that much in to help the worker do it. The people who really pay for the Carmichael model are families, and that's something that's been completely overlooked. So this has big effects. We've basically seen jobs that have been created hollow out the middle. We've seen the award system slip down and not give structures of support to the middle of the labour market in the way that it used to. And we've seen the Carmichael reforms fail to create a career path to let people move through the middle. So looking at overhead 12 then, what are the roots of this problem? Well, clearly this is a big issue, and I've only got 20 minutes today, I can't give you the full story. But in a nutshell, what we've seen are 2 key issues. The first is the dynamics of labour market fragmentation and the shifting of risk. Since the early 1980s, we've witnessed employers and business have a greater capacity to shift the costs and risks of employment and training onto workers. So that whereas in the past, if there was a downturn, an employer would hoard labour in the interests of keeping some extra capacity there. When the upturn came, that labour could then be rapidly redeployed. What we find now is that workers are often engaged through labour hire, as contractors, as outsourced providers. I mean, as soon as there's a downturn, that labour is shed. This leaves no ongoing commitment or engagement by the employer to the employee. This compromises safety and it compromises workforce development. This shift in risks has been phenomenally profitable for employers. If you look at GDP as a big economic cake, if you like, 20 years ago, profit share of GDP was 20%. Today, it is 30%. That means employers now have 10% more of GDP than they had 2 decades ago. This shift of the costs and the risks onto the workforce has been spectacularly successful for the business community, and that has led to the compromising of quality work. The second key force that's been at work has been our policy regime that we have in place. And policy, in fact, makes these problems worse, not better. The 3 that I want to talk to you about quickly are chronic problems in vet policy, the problem of mass-based higher education, which is institutionally based, and the problem of industrial relations, which is enterprise-based and looking after the needs of the low paid. I'll talk about each of these in turn. So just to elaborate on each of these issues in turn, the real problems with vet policy are that for about 20 years or so, it's had a completely dismembered concept of skill. It's had a vision that you can break down each task into a whole micro set of units, and that these units can then be reassembled as people like through a pick-a-docs approach. Skills do not operate in this way. Skills are usually linked in coherent ensembles, and it's obviously not very helpful for workers over time, because it simply means that people meet immediate needs with immediate requirements. It doesn't give them a legacy which they can take into the next job. The second big problem is mass higher education is based on institution-based learning. And what many employers want are people who've rounded their skills out in the workplace or on the job. Now, there's a growing interest in work-situated learning, but this is fairly marginal. And it means that whilst higher education has grown, it's not necessarily delivering graduates who are job ready. The third problem, which kind of crystallises it all, is that our industrial relations system has been built around a vision of enterprise bargaining, which basically treats each enterprise as an island, and a concern for the low paid. Now, that's kind of good for stopping the people at the bottom of the heap really losing it altogether, but it means we've lost any coherent notion of occupation or vocation, and that really strips out the capacity for people to think coherently about middle range skills. So what are we supposed to do, or what can we do about the intermediate skills and those in the middle? Well, if I'm looking now at overhead 14. Why are intermediate skills and the apprenticeship model of learning important? The first thing to note is that innovation does not simply come from people sitting in a lab in a white coat coming up with brilliant ideas. Clearly, breakthrough scientific research is important, but if you look at any successful economy, the Japanese and the Germans are exemplars of this. It's the power of people actually in the production process itself or in the delivery of a service who think of incremental change, and over time that leads to major innovation and breakthroughs. It's people at the intermediate level as well as those at the top who are a source of dynamism. The second thing that makes intermediate skills important is the apprenticeship model of learning has deep roots in providing people with what's called know-how. It's not just simply the ability to do monkey see, monkey do, and it's more than just having abstract knowledge that's given to them at university or in a RTR or a TAFE. It's the combination of both action and thought that leads to a dynamic interaction in practice. And intermediate skills through the apprenticeship system, when they've been reproduced through the apprenticeship system, have been very dynamic in terms of empowering individuals with talents they can take elsewhere in life, but it also helps workplaces because they've got capabilities that they are more than a school can give and are more than just learning on the job can do. So this means if we're thinking about the future and intermediate skills, we've got to look at occupational labour markets based around apprenticeships as a public good, because the society benefits, all employers in an industry benefit if there's a stock of people with this know-how or capability. And I think the real challenge for policy is not just to have public subsidies for education, that's commonly recognised in the education literature, but we've actually got to have new arrangements which allow employers to become self-reliant in giving their workforce the abilities they need to function at a higher order. And I think this is the challenge for moving forward. So I'm on page 15 now. How are we to do this? What's the new policy regime we need to make this happen? Well, I was on the expert panel for apprenticeships in the 21st century, and we argued about this a lot. And we basically identified a large number of initiatives that need to be undertaken. But the first and the most important one is that there needs to be a custodian for the apprenticeship system. Currently, the apprenticeship system has a good brand name, if you like, in society at large, but you know, the state training authorities look after the vet providers on the one hand, the industrial tribunals look after the awards and the agreements on the other. The federal government provides some funding for apprentices. You've got all these different bits and pieces which actually don't cohere, and there's a need for somebody or some institution to take responsibility and say apprenticeships are important, we need to look after their quality and we need to make all the parts of the system work together. That part of our recommendations, our main recommendation, has not been taken up, and that's been a big limitation, because until some group or somebody takes responsibility, the system will continue to atrophy. In the medium term, we need to think about really lifting the quality of the apprenticeship experience. Everyone agrees with apprenticeships as an idea, but if you talk to many apprentices today, they feel that the experience is not terribly productive or terribly rewarding. And this is because they are often operating in an environment that's restricted. There's not enough resources put into training them on the job. I'm a manager myself. I run a centre with 20 staff. I'm cash strapped. It's really hard for us to train people, but you've got to actually make an allocation for the training, because you then get the returns from the people once they've got an ability to perform more broadly. And I think there's a need for us to maybe start accrediting workplaces as either able to provide proper apprenticeship training or not. And if they're not accredited, they shouldn't get apprentices. The model here is what happens in the health system. Not every hospital is a teaching hospital, but we actually have some accredited teaching hospitals which provide the experiences which allow our doctors and our nurses to then get the skills they need to go elsewhere. And I think we need to think about the same for apprentices. Thirdly, and more ambitiously, in the longer term, I think we need to really renovate the notion of occupation or vocation. And I think talking to the electrical trades sector, This is kind of like, you know, selling coal to Newcastle. But I do think you guys have an important responsibility, because the logic of occupation, the commitment to craft and vocation, has not been something that has been respected for a long time in public policy, and it's important that we revitalise this vision. Now, I'm not saying we go back to the narrow demarcations of the past. We need to think of vocations in a more broad sense. We're currently doing research around the notion of care work. We think there are many commonalities for those involved in childcare, aged care and disability support. You don't have to have a whole plethora of qualifications in that area. Maybe we can talk about a more generic care qualification which has some specialties within it. Similarly, when we look at manufacturing these days, manufacturing isn't just simply people churning out widgets. People are involved in a logistics supply chain. They're involved with Kanban systems. They've got to understand the flow of goods, services and materials. And so if we think of a logistics vocation, you then get a different way of thinking about how people acquire skill and how they move. We've also identified commonalities in the areas of customer service, engineering, animal and land husbandry and IT and organisational support. Now, this is a big and ambitious agenda, I recognise that, but we've got big problems ahead. I started off by saying we've got the problem of skill shortages, we've got the problems of vet quality, we've got the problems of job quality, we've got the problems of workforce participation. Clearly our current policy regime is making the situation worse, not better. If we address these issues, if we get a proper custodian for the apprenticeship system, if we start to improve the quality of workplaces so that they're expansive in the way in which they offer opportunities instead of being restrictive, and if we have a broader notion of vocation, inform what's going on in the middle part of the labour market, I think we'll get far better outcomes than we currently have. Thank you.